This lecture is called Mesopotamia, and it talks about the seeds of creativity. Mesopotamia is an area that is located between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's the meaning of the word Mesopotamia, between the rivers, in modern-day Iraq. And that area was the most important part of what we know today as the Fertile Crescent. It was, as we could see in the map, an area that extended along the Mesopotamian area between the two rivers and then circled over the top into what we call the Levant. The Levant is that area at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that some people would call the Holy Land, but also takes in Phoenicia, ancient Phoenicia, today Lebanon, and Syria. We have pictured on the map that fertile area in Egypt, but that is a separate area. Some consider it part of the Fertile Crescent, but usually Egypt is separate. Many civilizations arose within the Mesopotamian area. These civilizations occurred more or less one after the other, at least in their power. The very first of these civilizations were the Sumerians, and they are characterized as being non-Semitic people. That is, their language was not descended from Shem, and therefore it is today still an unknown language. We do not know how to translate it. And they also built large edifices or buildings, pyramid-like structures called ziggurats. More on them in a moment. The next group that rose to power in the Mesopotamian area are the Akkadians, named after their principal city, and they evolved into the Babylonians, named after their principal city. We will encounter culture in Babylon later on in the Mesopotamian area, so some people have called this group the Akkadian Babylonian, and others just simply call it the Old Babylonians. And they are famous for the law code. The Hammurabi law code came from this period, and also the development of chariots, wheeled vehicles used principally for warfare. Another group that came into power are the Hittites. They came from Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and they are famous for iron technology. And because of that technology, they were able to dominate the other groups. After the Hittites, we see the Phoenicians, and here we've shown a coin because the Phoenicians were some of the earliest people to use coins, and they are famous for trade. They are along the coast of the Mediterranean. Modern-day Lebanon would be where Phoenicia was located, and they had to survive by trade because they didn't have enough land to survive by other means, and they used their proximity to the sea as their vehicle for making money. After the Phoenicians, we see the Israelites, and this would be the period when the Israelites were strong under the kings of Saul, David, and Solomon. And of course, the Israelites have given us religion as their major contribution to the modern world. We read in the Bible where the Assyrians came and conquered the northern 10 tribes and took them away. And that is the time of the Assyrian dominance of the Mesopotamian area. The Assyrians are famous for building huge and tremendous walls around their cities and for ruthless and torture-like treatment of the people under their control. Then we have another large group, and that group are the Babylonians, who then gave way to the Medes, who then gave way to the Persians. And they are famous for establishing the first of the truly great empires, stretching far beyond the confines of the Mesopotamian area, and for bringing tremendous riches through trade and through taxation and bureaucracy throughout this entire area. We will discuss each of those in some detail. First, let's talk about the Babylonians, the old Babylonians. They gave us the chariot, and here we can see a stone carving of a chariot from the Babylonian walls that date from this early Babylonian period. And there is a picture of a model of a chariot that we believe is similar to what was used anciently. Another of the societies was the Assyrians. Remember, these are the people who invented torture. They built great gates and walls, and here we see a picture of one of the gates where this very large winged lion creature guards the walls. Tremendous military presence with the Assyrians. Then we can see evidence of cuneiform. Here is the Cyrus the Great cylinder. On this cylinder, written in cuneiform, we see Cyrus's victory over the Persians, and we see how he was able to dominate both the earlier Mede and Babylonian civilizations. Cyrus was one of the great rulers and one of those that is mentioned in the Bible. In all of these societies, religion played a critical part. Initially, the gods of these Mesopotamian societies were associated with natural phenomena, rain or wind, maybe light or fertility. And when people worshiped the gods, they would make offerings and sacrifices in hopes of encouraging the gods to favor them in the area that the god was most powerful. So if they wanted to have a large crop, they might sacrifice alternately to the rain god and to the sun god. Or they might sacrifice to a fertility god if they wanted the crop to be especially fertile. Or that might be for their own family. Now, many of these stories come to us by way of what we call myth. And it's probably appropriate for us to stop for a moment and talk about what is the difference between a myth and religion. A myth teaches a principle, but is not to be taken as true. And therefore, when we say the myth of the Greek gods, we generally think of those as being stories that illustrate what the gods did, but even people who believed in those gods did not necessarily believe the myths. They knew that they were just simply ways of explaining phenomena that they encountered. Religion, on the other hand, teaches a principle as well, but it is to be believed as a matter of faith. And we could see an interesting situation within religion, however, where there are stories that may not be true. Let's take an example of a parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Although Christ gave this parable clearly to illustrate a principle, we don't know for sure, and he doesn't say, whether it was a real person who was journeying down the road to Jericho and was beset by thieves, or whether this is merely an illustrative story. And in the case of this parable, it may not make a difference, because the concept of the parable is to illustrate the principle. But it may be true, and therefore it would be interesting. There certainly is a road to Jericho, and along that road there is an inn called the Inn of the Good Samaritan, but that was built many years after Christ. Another interesting point of Mesopotamian religion is the belief in the influence of heavenly bodies on situations on earth. Now, we all know that the heavenly bodies have a tremendous influence. Day and night is, after all, influenced by the heavenly bodies. And so are the seasons of the year, and so are the tides. Well, those who watch the heavens very, very closely, and this would be true of the Mesopotamians in particular, they were able to identify 12 star constellations that, over a period of a solar year, appeared in the one after another in one particular direction. And that sequence of 12 solar constellations is called the zodiac. And they believed, that is, the ancient Mesopotamians believed, that those stars had an influence on our daily life. And therefore, they did readings of the stars and associated them with times of day, times of month, time of seasons, and all of those influences together constituted part of their religion. The early gods for the Mesopotamians were gods with names like Marduk and Baal. And these gods became associated with particular regions or cities or peoples. And therefore there was the Phoenician god, or there was the Assyrian god, or the Babylonian god, or, of course, the Hebrew god. And eventually these became linked to kings. And so the king had a strong identification with Marduk or Baal or even with Jehovah. And sometimes the gods and the king were in cooperation, or sometimes they were against each other. And as we read the Bible, for instance, we see that kings are identified as being righteous or unrighteous in their relationship with the God of the Hebrews. Sometimes these concepts were all brought together in these edifices that we call ziggurats. Ziggurats are very, very large, almost as big as the pyramids, although not quite as high. And on the top of the ziggurat, there is a place where the god can be worshipped. And so people would climb up the stairs of the ziggurat, and maybe only a priest, but sometimes the people as well, would approach this upper area on the ziggurat where they would be able to worship the gods. An interesting concept is that one of the ziggurats is in an area that is close to Babylon, and in fact may be the Tower of Babel. And it's logical to think that the Tower of Babel was constructed as one of these ziggurats. It was a temple, of course, and let's talk for a few moments about temples, because they are so important in the religions of the Mesopotamian area. A temple is simply a place where people can go to honor God, maybe to worship, or maybe to just draw close to God. The earliest temples were mountains, because God was assumed to be in the heavens, and mountains were the place where you could approach that God. Eventually, temples became a place where ordinances could be performed, ordinances of worship and perhaps ordinances of salvation. In the case of the Hebrews, Moses went up onto Mount Sinai after the Exodus, and there he stayed for 40 days and 40 nights and received instructions from God. The people knew that God was present because they saw the thunder and lightning and realized that that was Moses talking with God, or at least God's symbol of his presence. Eventually, Moses came down from the temple and he gave the people an offer. The offer was, do you want to enter into a special covenant with God? But the people refused the covenant. It was perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of unrighteousness. And therefore Moses was brokenhearted and returned again to the top of the mountain. There God instructed him that he could bring a second covenant, a lesser covenant. And therefore when Moses came back, he brought with him the lower covenant. And that was the covenant under which the Israelites continued to worship. As part of that lower covenant, a certain tribe of the Israelites, and there were 12 tribes in total, one of those tribes, the Levi, was given the right to be the priesthood. And they had special clothes that they wore and special ordinances that only they could perform. Sometimes those ordinances were performed on mountains, and sometimes on hills, and sometimes in woods. Eventually, Moses was told to build a tabernacle. And that tabernacle had 3 different areas. One of those areas is called the outer court. And in the outer court, there would be a large area called, a large structure called the altar. And on the altar, the sacrifices would be made. That's where the animals would be killed and burned. There was also a laver or laver, which is where the sacrifices were cleaned, and where the priests were also cleaned after performing the sacrifice. And the people could come up to and perhaps enter into the outer court. The second area is called the holy place, and this is actually inside a building in later temples, but at this point, of course, it was inside a special tent-like structure inside the overall tent. And this area in the holy place is where there were showbread, that is, bread signifying each of the 12 tribes. There were 12 loaves. The menorah, famous for being in the temple, was there, as well as incense, which signified prayers. And then finally, there was the Holy of Holies, a separate place deep in the tent or later in the building. And inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, which was built specifically to house the Ten Commandment tablets. And that Ark of the Covenant could be entered only by a single priest, only on one day of the year. So, in summary, the outer court had priests and some people. The holy place had only priests, and the Holy of Holies had only one priest and only one day per year. The Ark of the Covenant was taken from tribal area to tribal area after the Jews conquered the Promised Land. There was no one particular place where the Ark was located because they had no building, and therefore it moved among all of the tribes. Eventually, David conquered Jerusalem, and he named Jerusalem his capital and permanently located the Ark there. He then asked God if he could build a building suitable to house the Ark. In essence, he wanted to build the temple. God said that David could not build the temple, but he allowed David to gather the materials for the building of the temple, which he did. And then, upon his death, his son, Solomon, was given permission to build the temple, and he located that temple in Jerusalem on what is called the Temple Mount. And here is a picture of Jerusalem, the old city, and you could see the four quarters of the city: the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter, and then almost the same size as each of those individual quarters was an area called Temple Mount. Solomon chose as the site for his temple a place on a hill that today we call the Temple Mount. In the Muslim world, that place is called the Noble Sanctuary, and it's holy for the Muslims as well as for the Hebrews and the Christians. That temple area was so designated because it is believed that Abraham went there to sacrifice his son. In the Jewish and Christian belief, that son would have been Isaac. In the Muslim belief, that son would have been Ishmael. And there is another story associated with that particular lot of land. In Jewish tradition, Solomon picked the spot because of the story of two brothers. One brother was a poor bachelor who took grain to his married rich brother because the rich brother had such a large family. And the younger brother, who had less money and no children, wanted to participate with his older brother in sharing his goods with that family. It's also interesting that tradition has that the older brother, the rich brother, took grain to the poor brother and gave it to him because of poverty. So here's a case where both brothers, because of their love of each other and their generosity, gave grain to each other. A lovely story that illustrates some important concepts about temple. The present temple is actually oriented not in the north-south direction, but it is tilted toward Mecca because the present temple is actually laid out by Muslims in about the 8th century. But if we place on the Temple Mount the temple as we think it might have been located, and line that temple up with the major gate, the Golden Gate going through the wall, it points directly to the Mount of Olives. And it's possible that the sighting from the temple through the gate points to the Mount of Olives, which is, of course, the place where the Garden of Gethsemane may have been located. I've been to that place, and there is a Arab fellow who tends the garden. This is not a traditional garden. There's another place that many churches believe is traditional, but this This garden that I have been to on this occasion is a little further up the Mount of Olives, and I have received from that Arab who tends that garden a nice vial of olive oil that was pressed from the olives grown in what could possibly have been the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, Solomon built a temple there using the materials that were assembled by David and some others that were brought at the time of Solomon. There were 20,000 workers whose job was to just cut wood. 80,000 masons came to build the walls. This was, without any doubt, the greatest undertaking within the history of the Israelites. The finest materials were used, brought in from all over the Mediterranean area. And this is the origin of claims by the Masons that they helped build the Temple of Solomon. When the temple was built and sacrifices began, sacrifice was controlled exclusively by the priests, and they were told to take the breath and the blood of the animal together, and therefore the throats were slit of the animals, and that was the method of killing the animal prior to its sacrifice. This temple was used by the Israelites for many, many years. But eventually, in about 600 BC, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem and conquered the city and burned the temple and looted it. And by tradition, the ark was saved just in time but buried underneath the temple. No one knows where the Ark of the Covenant is today. Some believe that it is still under the temple, but there is no permit that allows the people, either Jews or Muslims, to dig under the temple site today. The losing of the temple was traumatic for the Jews, and I have a video now that we will see that talks about the Jews and their Babylonian captivity, their loss of the temple, and the change that was required of them in the Jewish religion.
The stories also contained another message. For those who accepted their guilt and changed their ways, there was hope.
If you return to your God, if with all your heart and all your soul you obey his voice, then he will bring back your captives. Should you have been banished to the very sky's end, your God will gather you again, even from there.
For the short term, it was obvious what they had to do. They had to look at the covenant, and they had to start living by the covenant in exile. And what you actually see in the Babylonian exile is the transformation of Israelite religion into something new that we can call the earliest form of Judaism.
In Babylon, the Judeans embraced the belief in one all-powerful God as never before.
After several years of captivity in Babylon, some Jews were allowed by Cyrus the Great to return to Jerusalem. Many stayed behind, and they gave up the temple as part of their religion. But those who returned rebuilt the temple. This occurred around 500 to 400 BC. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible talk about the rebuilding of the temple. Sometimes that temple is called the Zerubbabel temple because he was governor of Jerusalem at the time. Most often, however, it is simply referred to as the Second Temple. It was, sadly, not as luxurious as the original Temple of Solomon. Later on, the Persians were conquered by the Greeks under Alexander. When that happened, the Greek influence became overwhelming within this period of time. It influenced every group of people, and some of the Jews were offended by Greek culture and tried to resist it. Those who wanted to stay apart became known as the Pharisees, a name, of course, that we recognize from the Bible. Eventually, the Greeks wanted to unite all of the people under their control into a single religion, and the Jewish religion was not that religion, and therefore they forced the Jews to abandon their religion, and in fact the temple was defiled under these Greeks. That occurred about 167 years BC. The Greek ruler was so adamant that he forced swine to be sacrificed on the altars of the temple, of course desecrating them. And the Jewish people were angry, and they began a revolt. The revolt was led by a family called the Maccabees, and eventually these Maccabees were successful, and they were able to throw out the Greeks and establish for a period a kingdom under the control of the Jews, the Maccabees. They cleaned the temple, and then they rededicated the temple. But at the time of rededication, these people were very, very poor, and they didn't have sufficient oil to keep the menorah burning for the 7 days of dedication. But miraculously, the menorah burned during that entire period. And that miracle is celebrated today in Hanukkah, which is sometimes called the Festival of Lights, and it has to do with this celebration of the rededication of the temple by the Maccabees. So for about 150 years, the Jews were able to rule themselves, but eventually the Maccabean rulers also became corrupt. They took control over the priesthood. They appointed priests. They linked the priests to themselves, and they got control of the temple, and therefore the religion started to decay. And during this period of time, we have a group of priests who became strongly political, and they are called the Sadducees, also a name that is familiar to us from the Bible. Eventually, with the corruption of the Maccabees, there became internal revolts, and problems just broke out everywhere. There was chaos throughout the land of Judea, and therefore the Romans, who were powerful in the Mediterranean during this period, simply stepped in and took control in order to maintain the peace. And when they did that, they chose a man named Herod as the king over this area. Herod was part Jew, and he was therefore reasonably acceptable to many of the Jewish leaders, and he was acceptable to the Romans because he was a friend of some of the Roman emperors. Herod decided that he would refurbish and expand the temple, and therefore he started to build the temple. And here we see a picture of what Herod's temple might have looked like. This is a model that we can see, that can be seen just outside of the city of Jerusalem. He did it to try and gain favor with the Jews because he was not fully a Jew, and there were some who did not like him. The temple was large and luxurious, and it had a very interesting rock style that was kind of a picture frame, a square with an outer square around it. And if you go to Jerusalem today and you look at the walls of the temple that can be seen, those walls are dressed in the stone that we call Herodian stone, and it is of this picture frame style. During the time of Herod, he continued the strong linkage between the Jewish leaders, especially the priests, and himself. And he was in the habit of naming who the priest would be. And therefore, the priests became corrupted and politically involved. Speaking strictly from the political standpoint, we know that that was a period of time when the Romans were worried about revolts. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that Christ's crucifixion was justified in the minds of the Romans, and that was that the Jews said that Christ wanted to be a Messiah, and that meant that he wanted to lead a revolt. About 66 AD, there was a revolt in the land of Judea, and it was a revolt led by a man who called himself a Messiah. The Romans would not tolerate any kind of revolt, and therefore they came in and ruthlessly crushed the revolt and burned and looted the temple. It's interesting that we can go to Rome today and see in the Ark of Titus an arch that commemorates this victory, a picture, and here it's shown on the screen, of the Roman soldiers carrying away the menorah and other artifacts from the temple. The Jews were physically removed from Jerusalem, not allowed to live in the vicinity, not only at the end of this revolt, but there was another revolt about 60 years later that further solidified the Roman desire to remove the Jews from the land of Jerusalem. And the Jews were scattered throughout the world. That's a process that we now call the diaspora. And when that happened, the Jews had to adapt to a new religion, a religion without a temple, because this time they were not going to be allowed to have a temple. And they began to worship in what is called synagogues. There were some synagogues, it means simply a place of gathering or a place of worship. There were some previously, but now this is all they had, and so the presence of the synagogue became ever more important. But there was a very serious problem for the Jews. Without the temple, how could they be saved? Because the practice of taking animals to the temple and having them sacrificed was a method of the Jews getting rid of their sins. The expiation of sins, in essence, the atonement for the Jews, occurred with the sacrifice of these animals. And without the temple, there would be no possibility of salvation, no way of expiating their sins. And so they had to rethink the entire religion. How could it possibly be a religion that would save mankind if there was no way to rid us of our sins? Here's a video that talks about how the rise of this new religion occurred.
It was a new approach to Judaism. Ezra had given the people the Torah to live by its laws. But thanks to Ben Sira and others like him, Jews eager for an alternative to Greek culture began studying the lives of the Bible's heroes, searching for the divine wisdom their stories revealed. As this practice became more and more widespread, a new idea arose, that the writers of the Bible were divinely inspired, and therefore everything in the Bible was true.
The idea of divine inspiration of Scripture seems to have emerged actually rather slowly and piecemeal.
As we've seen in the video, step one in the formation of the new Hebrew religion was a new view of Scripture. That was all they had. And they knew that God would leave them with some method of obtaining salvation, and therefore they viewed the Scriptures as the means by which they could obtain that salvation. But they had to go to step two. Step two in the new religion was the rise of rabbis, teachers, people who could explain the Scriptures to them. They also understood that they must gather together in synagogues, and therefore the use of synagogue was revived and expanded. And they also realized that they had to show a personal dedication to God through prayer. And prayers, which were rarely used prior to this time, became an important part of the Jewish religion. Here's a video that gives us some further explanation of the changes in the Jewish religion.
Eventually, Yohanan and the other teachers would be given a new title, Rabbi.
It was at this point that the Pharisees effectively evolve into what we call the rabbis.
The Talmud says that Yohanan's greatest challenge in keeping Judaism alive was his fellow rabbis' despair over the loss of the temple.
Woe unto us, Rabbi Joshua cried out, that the place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for is laid waste. My son, Rabbi Yohanan said to him, be not grieved. We have another atonement as effective as this. And what is that? It is acts of loving kindness. For as it is written, I desire mercy and not sacrifice.
Yohanan had found his answer to the loss of the temple by studying the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. He was following in an ancient tradition. For ever since the long-ago days of exile in Babylon, men eager to learn about God had been discussing the stories and laws of the Bible in meeting places called synagogues. With the temple gone, the rabbis began to rebuild Judaism around the study of the Bible in the synagogue. Here, they debated how biblical law could be applied to living an ethical and compassionate life. In the temple, only the priests had been allowed to communicate with God through sacrifice. Now, in the synagogue, rabbis and common people alike talked to God through prayer, a previously little-used practice favored by the writers of the Book of Psalms.
After the changes that we have discussed, the Jews felt that they needed to solidify the religion and expand upon it with opinion by great scholars. Therefore, they decided that they would write down these scholarly attitudes, and that was done, and it was done in two locations. The Babylonian Jews wrote it down, and those in Palestine wrote it down, and these were called the Talmuds. They were written usually in about the 2nd century and a few years beyond that, and they are mostly books of discussion and arguments about where God would like them to go. What does that mean for the Jewish religion today? Well, the Jews still yearn for the temple and anticipate that someday the temple will be rebuilt. In the meantime, they go to the holiest place that they know of, and that is what is called the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall. This is the place where the original walls of Solomon's temple, really the original walls of Herod's temple, can still be encountered. And the Jews go there to pray. As we see, there is a place where individuals can walk up to the wall and they can pray. They can take small pieces of paper on which they have written names of people who are to be remembered in a special prayer, and they insert those prayer rolls or scrolls into the cracks in the wall. And we can see, if when you go there, that there is a separation along the wall in men and women, and the men and women must stay on their individual sides. This is also a popular place for a bar mitzvah, which is the coming of age of a young man. And here we see in this picture a bar mitzvah that is being done at the Western Wall. We also see a guide who is standing with a shawl over his shoulders. That shawl is a prayer shawl that is put on by righteous people, righteous Jews who are seeking to have an even closer association with God than they would receive without the shawl. And there are remembrances of the temple even in the names that are given to some synagogues. Large synagogues are sometimes called Jewish temples, but they are never to be thought of as being the temple of the order of Solomon, because that temple is yet to be built in the minds of the Jews. Therefore, we see religion has been critical to civilization throughout the Mediterranean, or throughout the Mesopotamian period. It was an important part of all of civilization, but especially in Mesopotamia. Thank you.